When they came back for the body, there was almost nothing left to bury. A skull, 2 feet, the palms of 2 hands. That is the inventory the text gives us, and it gives it without flinching, because the point of the scene is that nothing else remained. No corpse to wash, no bones to carry home, nothing to lay in a tomb. A queen of Israel, the daughter of a king of Tyre, the widow of one king and the mother of 2 more, ended as a stain on a courtyard wall in Jezreel and a scattering of bone the dogs had left behind. Her name was Jezebel, and if you know only one thing about her, it is probably not any of that. It is that her name became a word. Not a person, a word. An accusation you can throw at a woman you have never met. 3 syllables that have outlived the kingdom she ruled, the language she spoke, the gods she prayed to, and every stone of the palace she lived in. She has been dead for something close to 28 centuries, and the word is still working. So here is the question I want to put to you, and I want to put it plainly, because it is not a comfortable one. Everything you have ever heard about this woman comes from a single source. That source was written down by her enemies. It was compiled and edited generations after she died, in a rival kingdom, by scribes who had a theological argument to win, and who used her to win it. That does not mean it is false. I want to be careful here, and I am going to be careful all the way through, because the easy move is to flip the story over and make her a heroine, and the easy move is a lie in the other direction. But it does mean that when you read the account of Jezebel, you are not reading a neutral record, you are reading a case for the prosecution. And the prosecution wrote the only surviving transcript. What I want to do is read that transcript the way a historian reads a hostile witness. Not to acquit her, not to convict her, to find out what is actually there, what the text is silent about, and what the ground itself has given up in the last 150 years of digging. Because there is a second story running underneath this one, told in Assyrian stone and Moabite basalt and 12,000 fragments of carved ivory, and it does not say what you would expect it to say. If you want to walk through this with me, subscribe and turn on notifications, so the next part of the story finds you when it comes. And leave a comment, and tell me where in the world you are watching from tonight. I read them, so let us begin where every honest reading of this story has to begin. Not with the woman, with the men who wrote her down. Part 1. The men who held the pen. The books we call 1st and 2nd Kings are not a diary. Nobody was standing in the courtyard at Jezreel with a stylus. What we have is the closing section of a much larger work, a continuous history that runs from Deuteronomy through Joshua, Judges, Samuel and into Kings, and scholars have a name for it. They call it the Deuteronomistic history. The name comes from the fact that the whole sweep of it is measured against the standards set out in the book of Deuteronomy. One God, one place of worship, one covenant, with blessings for keeping it and catastrophe for breaking it. Every king in the whole long parade gets graded against that ruler, and the grade is usually a single sentence. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord. The reins get compressed into verdicts. In 1943, a German scholar named Martin Noth argued that this entire history was the work of a single editor, working in exile in Babylon, gathering older sources and shaping them into one enormous explanation for the worst thing that had ever happened to his people. Why did we lose the land? Because of this. And this. And this. 30 years later, Frank Moorcross modified the picture in a way that has shaped English-speaking scholarship ever since. He argued for 2 editions. A first version composed before the exile, in the reign of King Josiah in Jerusalem, around 620 before the Common Era, written to support Josiah's reform program. Then a second edition revised in exile after the disaster to account for a catastrophe the first version never saw coming. Other scholars, working mainly in Germany, proposed a different arrangement, with several exilic layers, a base historian, a prophetic reviser, and a later editor concerned with the law. You will see them abbreviated in the literature. Richard Nelson defended and refined the two-edition model. Thomas Armour represents more recent attempts to hold the whole conversation together. I am not going to ask you to keep track of the layers. The layers are a live argument, and they will still be a live argument long after this video. What I want you to hold on to is the thing all of these scholars agree on, because it is the foundation of everything that follows. The story of Jezebel was written down, edited, and given its final shape by scribes in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was the capital of Judah. Jezebel was queen in Israel, the separate northern kingdom, a rival state with its own dynasty, its own sanctuaries, and its own foreign policy. And the writing happened generations after she died, by men committed to a standard of exclusive worship that, as we will see, was very far from settled in her own lifetime. So think about what that means. This is a southern account of a northern queen, composed by the losing side's rivals centuries downstream, with a theological argument running through every paragraph. The archaeologist Israel Finkelstein has put the problem about as bluntly as it can be put. The Hebrew Bible, he writes, was produced by Judahite authors in Jerusalem, and it transmits Judahite ideas. Its treatment of the northern kingdom is mostly telegraphic, and its tone is negative. Northern kings are presented as illegitimate almost by definition. And here is the detail that should stop you, because it is the single clearest measurement of the bias, and it has nothing to do with Jezebel at all. Omri, her father-in-law, the man who founded the dynasty she married into, who built the capital city, whose name the Assyrian Empire used for the kingdom of Israel for more than a century after his death. The Bible gives him 6 verses. 6. And by Finkelstein's count, only one of them tells you anything at all. That is not an oversight. That is an editorial decision. The men who held the pen looked at the most internationally significant king the Northern Kingdom ever produced, and decided he was worth 6 verses and a bad grade. Which raises the question that runs underneath this entire video. If they compressed the founder of the dynasty into 6 verses, what exactly were they doing with the woman they hated? Before we can answer that, you need to see the kingdom they were writing about. Not the version in the 6 verses, the version the rest of the ancient world actually dealt with. Part 2. The kingdom the Bible almost erased. There is a slab of stone in the British Museum, brought back from a mound in southeastern Turkey, carved on the orders of Shalmaneser III, king of Assyria. It is called the Kirk Monolith, and it records a battle fought in the year 853 before the Common Era at a place called Karkar, on the Orontes River in Syria. Assyria was expanding westward. A coalition of local kings formed to stop it. The monolith lists them, one by one, with the forces each of them brought, in the flat bookkeeping style of a war ministry. And there in the list is Ahab the Israelite, Jezebel's husband. 2,000 chariots, 10,000 foot soldiers. Take a moment with that number. 2,000 chariots was the largest chariot force in the entire coalition. Hadadezer of Damascus, the great regional power, the kingdom that spends most of the biblical narrative bullying Israel, brought 1,200. Ahab brought nearly twice as many. I want to be honest about the number, because the channel is worth more to you if I am. Some scholars think it is inflated. Nadav Naaman argued back in 1976 that the figure may be an exaggeration or a scribal error in the Assyrian text itself, and that argument has never gone away. Assyrian royal inscriptions were not modest documents, but even a heavily discounted Ahab is a serious military power, and the reason we can have this argument at all is that this is the first time an Israelite king is named in any source outside the Bible. The first. Ahab of Israel enters world history not through scripture, but through an Assyrian battle report. And here is what I find genuinely striking. The Battle of Karkar is not in the Bible. At all. The largest military engagement we can document for the reign of Ahab, the one where he fielded the biggest chariot force in the Levant, does not appear in the account of his reign. The men who held the pen did not think it was relevant. They were writing about altars. Then there is a block of black basalt in the Louvre, set up by Mesha, king of Moab, around 840. Mesha is telling his own story, and he tells it the way kings do, but he opens with the humiliation he had to overcome. Omri, king of Israel, he says, oppressed Moab many days. The stone records that Israelite domination as a fact of Moabite life, and it records Mesha throwing it off. It also contains the earliest mention of the name of the God of Israel found outside the Bible, on a monument raised by a foreign king to celebrate beating Israel, and it uses that phrase, the House of Omri. Then there is the Tel Dan inscription, a shattered Aramaic victory stela from roughly the same decade, most likely set up by Hazael of Damascus, which names a king of Israel from this dynasty and, in the same broken lines, refers to the House of David. It is one of the most important inscriptions ever found in the region, and it carries an irony we will come back to at the end, because the version of events it tells does not match the version in 2 Kings. And finally there is the black obelisk of Shalmaneser, again in the British Museum, carved around 827. 5 registers of relief, and in the second one, a man kneels with his face to the ground before the Assyrian king, and the caption identifies him. Jehu, son of Omri. That is the only surviving picture of an Israelite king, any Israelite king, and it shows the man who destroyed this dynasty on his face paying tribute in the year 841. But look at what Assyria calls him, son of Omri. Jehu was no relation to Omri whatsoever. He was the general who slaughtered Omri's entire family. Assyria did not care. To the imperial scribes, Israel was the house of Omri, and it stayed the house of Omri long after there was no Omri left alive. So put the two accounts side by side. In the Assyrian and Moabite records, this is a wealthy, well-armed, internationally significant territorial state, a kingdom the great powers negotiated with and named after its founder. In the Bible, it is 6 verses and a verdict. Both of those are true at once. That is the discipline this story demands. The men in Jerusalem were not lying about the Omrides. They were doing something more interesting than lying. They were deciding what counted, and the woman at the centre of this video counted enormously. Which brings us to the reason she was there in the first place, and it is not the reason you were taught. Part 3. The daughter of Ethbaal. 1 Kings 16, verse 31 is the sentence that starts everything. Ahab took as his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal king of the Sidonians. That is the whole introduction. One clause. No description of her, no age, no account of the wedding, no word about what she thought of any of it. The text is not interested in her as a person at this point. It is interested in her as a category. She is the foreign wife, and the sentence that follows immediately is about Ahab serving Baal. But hold on the name of her father, because he is a real man, and we know things about him from outside the Bible. Ethbaal, or Ethbaal, ruled Tyre in the first half of the 9th century. Reference works put his reign roughly between 887 and 856. Our information about him comes to us at second hand through the Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, who was quoting a Phoenician historian named Menander of Ephesus, who had access to the archives of Tyre itself. I want to flag that clearly because it matters for how much weight it can carry. What follows is not scripture. It is Josephus quoting Menander quoting Tyrian records, and every link in that chain has some slack in it. According to that chain, Ethbaal was a priest of the goddess Astarte who came to the throne by killing his predecessor, a man named Pheles, and who then reigned for 32 years. He founded a new dynasty at Tyre and pushed Tyrian power up and down the Levantine coast. A priest who murdered his way to a throne, if that is accurate. Then Jezebel grew up in a court where religious office and royal power were the same instrument, held in the same hands, and where the throne had been taken by force within living memory. Now you will hear people say that this explains her, that she was a fanatic because her father was a priest. I am not going to tell you that, because the sources do not support it. Nobody recorded what Jezebel believed. Nobody recorded whether she was devout or indifferent, whether she chose anything about her own life, or whether she was a teenager put on a cart and sent south as part of a treaty. That silence is real, and I am going to keep pointing at it, because the history of this woman is mostly a history of people filling that silence with whatever they needed her to be. What we can reconstruct is why the marriage happened, and it had nothing to do with religion. Tyre in the 9th century was one of the great commercial powers of the Mediterranean world, a city built on an island, effectively unconquerable by the methods of the age, running fleets from one end of the sea to the other, cedar from the mountains behind it, purple dye from murex shells, the most expensive colour in the ancient world, so valuable that the Greeks eventually named the whole people after it, metalwork, glass, ivory carving of a quality nobody in the interior could match, trading colonies spreading west toward the coast of North Africa, and Israel, under Omri and then Ahab, was an inland agricultural kingdom sitting directly across the routes that connected the coast to the interior, with grain and oil to sell and no port worth the name. That is not a religious relationship. That is a business relationship, and a strategic one. Both kingdoms were watching Damascus, and behind Damascus, the growing shadow of Assyria, which we have just seen them both facing at Karkar. An alliance between the coastal trading power and the inland military power made obvious sense to everyone involved. So it was sealed the way alliances were sealed in the ancient Near East. With a daughter, this is worth saying plainly, because the biblical framing has trained us out of hearing it. Jezebel was a treaty. She was the living instrument of a foreign policy agreement sent to a foreign court to be the guarantee that two kingdoms would keep faith with each other. And she came with what a princess of Tyre came with: her household, her craftsmen, her advisors, her retinue, and her gods. Because that is how this worked. A royal marriage moved a woman between courts, and the gods of her house moved with her. Nobody expected a Tyrian princess to arrive in Samaria and forget who she had been. That was not a betrayal of the arrangement. That was the arrangement. Which brings us to the accusation at the heart of the whole story, and to a detail I find genuinely remarkable. Because once you notice it, you cannot unnotice it. Part 4. The God with no name. Everyone knows what Jezebel is accused of. She brought in Baal. Now who was Baal? I want you to sit with how strange the answer is, because the text you are about to hear from is the text that convicts her, and on this one point it declines to say a word. The word Baal is not really a name. In the Semitic languages of the region it means lord, or master, or owner. It functions as a title. There were many gods to whom it could be attached, and it is attached to different ones in different cities and different centuries. Baal of this place, Baal of that mountain, Baal of the storm. 1 Kings 16 tells us that Ahab set up an altar for Baal in a house of Baal that he built in Samaria and made an Asherah. And that is it. The text never tells us which Baal. It never gives the god a proper name, never describes a rite, never explains a single thing about what was actually done in that building. Scholars have been arguing about the identification for well over a century, and the argument is still open. The most common answer is Melkart, whose name means king of the city, the patron god of Tyre itself, the divine protector of the very dynasty Jezebel came from. Josephus points that way. He writes that Jezebel built a temple to the god of the Tyrians, whom they call Belus. If it is Melkart, then what Jezebel installed in Samaria was not generic paganism at all. It was the state cult of her homeland, the god of her father's throne, exactly what a foreign queen would be expected to maintain. But the scholar John Day has argued that it was more probably Baal Shemem, Lord of the Heavens, a title used for the great storm god Hadad, a figure with much wider circulation across the whole region. And the standard reference works when you press them will tell you what the honest position is. Probably Melkart. But there is no conclusive proof. So we have a woman whose entire historical reputation rests on the god she is said to have brought, and we cannot say with confidence which god that was. Because the men who wrote the account did not think it was worth recording, and that tells you something important about what they were doing. They were not writing comparative religion. They were not interested in the theology of Tyre. To them, the entire content of the charge was that it was not the Lord. The identity of the rival was a detail. The category was the point. There is a second question underneath this one, and it is a genuinely open one. Did Jezebel impose this worship on the kingdom, or did she practice it in her own household? The text can be read both ways, and scholars read it both ways. On one hand, 1 Kings 16 says a temple was built in the capital city, and a temple in the capital is a public act of state, sponsored by the crown. On the other hand, the most vivid phrase the text gives us about her religious activity is that the prophets ate at Jezebel's table. That is the language of personal patronage. Her table. Her household budget. A queen maintaining her own religious establishment as a Tyrian princess in a foreign court would. The difference matters enormously for how you judge her. One version is a foreign queen forcing a nation to abandon its god. The other is a foreign queen keeping her own religion in her own rooms, at a court that had made an alliance knowing exactly what came with it. The text does not resolve it. I am not going to resolve it for you either. But there is something else in that same verse, something standing right next to Baal that most readers skate straight past, and it opens onto the single most uncomfortable discovery in the archaeology of Israelite religion. Part 5. The God's Wife. And made an Asherah. 4 words at the end of the list of Ahab's offences, and they carry more freight than almost anything else in the chapter. Asherah is 2 things in the Hebrew Bible, and the ambiguity is in the text itself. She is a goddess, a great mother goddess, known across the Canaanite and wider West Semitic world, consort of the high god in the older mythology. And an Asherah is also an object, a wooden pole or stylized tree set up beside an altar, the kind of thing the reforming kings are repeatedly said to have cut down and burned. For a long time, the assumption of most readers was simple. Israel worshipped the Lord, the neighbours worshipped Asherah, foreign queens like Jezebel dragged the goddess in from outside, and prophets and reformers threw her out. Then, in the 1970s, people started digging. At a remote site in the eastern Sinai called Kuntilet Irud, a way station on a desert route, excavators found large storage jars and plaster wall fragments covered in drawings and Hebrew inscriptions, dating to somewhere in the range of 830 to 750 before the Common Era. That is the century after Jezebel, and among the inscriptions were blessing formulas, ordinary ones, the kind of thing a traveller writes, "I bless you by the Lord, and by his Asherah." At Cura-Bet-el-Com, a tomb in the Judean hills, a little later, around 725, an inscription carved into a pillar carries the same construction. The Lord and his Asherah. Now, what does that phrase mean? This is one of the most fiercely contested questions in the field, and I want to represent it honestly. Some scholars argue it means the goddess herself, standing beside the God of Israel as a consort. Others argue that Hebrew grammar makes that reading difficult, and that what is meant is the cult object, the sacred pole, a piece of sanctuary furniture belonging to the Lord. There is no consensus. There has been no consensus for 40 years, but notice that both readings land you in the same place for our purposes. Either way, ordinary Israelites and Judahites, writing casual blessings on jars and tomb walls, in Hebrew, invoking the name of the Lord, saw nothing at all strange about mentioning an Asherah in the same breath. This is part of a much larger reconstruction, associated with scholars like Mark Smith, William Dever, Zioni Zevit, Susan Ackerman, and the team of Othmar Kiel and Christoph Eulinger. Their argument, broadly, is that the religion of ancient Israel did not begin as pure monotheism and then decline into corruption. It developed. It emerged over centuries out of the wider West Semitic religious world it belonged to, moving gradually toward the exclusive worship of one God, and that exclusive position became dominant much later than the biblical narrative implies. I want to be careful with how far I push this, because it is a scholarly reconstruction, not a piece of scripture and not a proven fact. And there are serious scholars who resist parts of it, but if it is even broadly correct, look at what it does to the case against Jezebel. The charge against her is that she corrupted a pure faith, that she took a nation that worshipped the Lord alone and turned it aside. That is the story, and it is the story her enemies wrote. What the ground suggests is that the strict, exclusive, one-God-only standard by which she is being judged was not yet the settled majority position of her own society. It was a movement, a demanding, prophetic minority movement that would eventually win, and would eventually write the history, and would eventually go back through the record of the kings and grade every one of them by a ruler that had not finished being made when most of them were alive. Jezebel is not being judged by the standards of her time. She is being judged by the standards of the people who won the argument 300 years later. That is not a defense of her. Set it down carefully, because I am not offering it as one. A queen who kills prophets has done something no reconstruction of religious history excuses. But it changes what the accusation actually is. She was not uniquely dragging Israel into something alien. She was a conspicuous, foreign, royal, and therefore useful example of something that was, on the evidence in the ground, extremely common. She made a very good villain. She was foreign, she was female, she was powerful, and she was on the losing dynasty. And then she did something that made her a permanent one. But before we get to the vineyard, we have to go up a mountain, because that is where the whole conflict finally catches fire. Part 6. The mountain and the 400 who were never there. The drought comes first, 3 years without rain in a kingdom that lived on rain, in a land with no great river to fall back on, where the barley harvest depended entirely on whether the sky opened in the autumn. 3 years is not an inconvenience. 3 years is starvation, dead livestock, abandoned villages, and a king riding out personally with his household steward to look for grass. And there is a footnote to that drought, which I find quietly remarkable, and which almost nobody mentions. Josephus, drawing on that same Phoenician source we met earlier, records that during the reign of Ethbaal at Tyre, there was a drought lasting a full year, which broke only after the king made supplications and a heavy thunderstorm came. Ethbaal, Jezebel's father, reigning up the coast in the same decades. Now I want to be careful about what that is and is not. It is not proof of the biblical drought. The lengths do not match, a year against 3, and the details are entirely different, and Josephus is writing the better part of 1,000 years after the fact. But two independent traditions, one Israelite and one Tyrian, preserving a memory of a severe drought in the eastern Mediterranean in the same generation, is the kind of small, unglamorous convergence that historians take seriously. Nobody was coordinating those stories. They had no reason to. It is worth holding on to, because it cuts against the lazy assumption that everything in this narrative is invention. Underneath the theology there is a real 9th century, with real weather and real hunger and real consequences for a dynasty that had to answer for both. And into that, 1 Kings drops one of the most disturbing verses in the whole account, and it is easy to miss because it arrives inside a subordinate clause about somebody else. Chapter 18, verse 4. When Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them, 50 to a cave, and fed them with bread and water. 50 to a cave. That detail is why I believe this passage is doing something more than sloganeering. It is too specific and too domestic to be decoration. Somebody is remembering logistics. 2 caves. 100 men. Bread and water carried out in secret by a man who held office in the palace of the king, whose wife was hunting them, and who is described in the same chapter as fearing the Lord greatly. Obadiah is running a resistance operation out of the royal household. I have said the text is a hostile source, and I meant it, and I am going to keep saying it. But being hostile is not the same as being empty. A hostile source can preserve genuine memory, and a hostile source can be reporting real events. The charge here is state violence against religious dissidents, and there is nothing implausible about it in a 9th century Near Eastern monarchy. Royal houses killed prophets. That is what royal houses did with prophets who would not stop talking. So then Elijah calls the contest, and here we hit the textual crux I promised you. Verse 19. Elijah tells Ahab to gather all Israel to Mount Carmel, and to bring the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. 450 and 400. 850 men. And every retelling you have ever heard treats them as one crowd. Now watch what happens next in the chapter. The altars are built, the bulls are cut, the prophets of Baal call on their God from morning until noon, and they leap on the altar, and they cry aloud and cut themselves, and Elijah mocks them, and the fire falls, and the people seize the prophets and bring them down to the brook Kishon. And through all of that, the 400 prophets of Asherah are simply not there. They are summoned in verse 19 and they never appear again. Not at the altar, not in the mockery, not in the slaughter at the brook. They vanish out of the story the moment after they are named. Commentators have noticed this for a very long time, and a good many scholars regard that clause about the 400 as a secondary addition to the text, a later expansion that tightened the connection between Jezebel and Asherah. I am giving you that as a scholarly judgment, not a certainty, and there are other explanations. But it is a real seam in the fabric, and it is exactly the kind of thing that gets sanded smooth in the retelling. Which is worth pausing on. The single most famous line binding Jezebel to the goddess Asherah, the line that puts 400 of the goddess's prophets on her personal payroll, may be a later hand strengthening the case. And then, when it is over, we get the one moment in this entire account before her death where Jezebel speaks. Chapter 19, verse 2. She sends a messenger to Elijah, and her message is a death sentence delivered as an oath. So let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by this time tomorrow. Consider what that sentence is. She has just been told that 850 men under her protection, or 450 of them, have been dragged to a stream and killed, and she does not summon the guard, and she does not move quietly. She sends a herald to tell the man personally that he has until tomorrow. You can read that as raw tyranny. Many people do. But notice something else about it. She gives him a day. The most feared woman in the kingdom announces her intention to a man she could simply have killed, and gives him a head start, and he takes it. The prophet who has just faced down a king and 850 rivals on a mountaintop hears one message from this woman and runs south out of the kingdom entirely, out past Beersheba into the wilderness, and sits down under a broom tree and asks God to let him die. That is the measure of her power in this text, not armies. One message. He goes on to Horeb, to the mountain, to the cave, and to the wind and the earthquake and the fire and the low voice after them. And when he is sent back with instructions that amount to a death warrant for the entire dynasty. The machinery that will end at that window in Jezreel is set in motion here, on a mountain in the south, by a man who ran. But it is not the mountain that seals her, it is a piece of ground about the size of a garden. Part 7. The Vineyard. 1 Kings 21 is the chapter that made Jezebel permanent, and I want to walk through it slowly, because almost everything in it is being read through the wrong lens. Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard beside the palace at Jezreel. Ahab wants it. And notice how reasonable the king's opening offer is. He does not demand it. He asks to buy it, and he offers either a better vineyard elsewhere or the full price in silver. That is a fair market offer from a man who could have simply taken it. And Naboth says no, but listen to how he says no, because the wording is the whole chapter. The Lord forbid that I should give the inheritance of my fathers to you, not my property, not my land, the inheritance of my fathers. The Hebrew word is nahalah, and it does not mean real estate. It means the portion of the land allotted to a family, held in trust across generations, tied to a lineage rather than to an individual. The principle behind it runs right through the law. Leviticus 25 puts it about as directly as it can be put. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. The Book of Numbers protects the same principle in the inheritance rules. In that world, a man does not really own his field, he holds it for the dead and for the unborn. It cannot be permanently alienated. It goes back. So Naboth is not being stubborn, and he is not haggling. He is telling the king that the transaction the king is proposing is not one he has the right to make. And the astonishing thing about the story, the thing that gets lost entirely, is that Ahab accepts it. He goes home. He lies on his bed, turns his face to the wall, and will not eat. The king of Israel, commander of 2,000 chariots, sulking because a farmer said no and he knows the farmer is right. This is where scholars have found a much larger conflict encoded in a very small dispute. Albrecht Alt argued, in a study that has shaped the discussion ever since, that what we are watching is a collision between two entire conceptions of land. The old Israelite village conception, in which land belongs to families and lineages and cannot be sold away, and a royal conception, in which land is ultimately at the disposal of the crown. That reading has been developed by some and criticised by others, and the argument continues. But the core insight has held up well, and it reframes the prophetic opposition to this dynasty in a way that ought to be uncomfortable for anyone who has only ever heard the religious version. Because if that reading is right, then the fight between the prophets and the house of Ahab was never only about which god, it was also about land, about royal estates swallowing family plots, about a monarchy becoming wealthy and international and centralised, and the people underneath it losing the ground their grandfathers held. And then Jezebel walks into the room. Are you not the one who governs Israel? Get up, eat bread, and let your heart be cheerful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. That line is the collision in a single sentence. It is not the voice of a wicked woman. It is the voice of a Tyrian royal house, where the king's will is simply what happens. She is not proposing a crime. She is expressing genuine bewilderment that a king would accept no for an answer. She thinks the whole business is beneath him. And then she does what she does, and I am not going to soften it, because it does not deserve softening. She writes letters in Ahab's name and seals them with his seal, and sends them to the elders and the nobles of Naboth's own city. And the instructions are exact. Proclaim a fast. Set Naboth at the head of the people, and set 2 men, sons of Belial, before him, to bear witness against him, saying, You have blasphemed God and the king. Then carry him out and stone him, that he may die. Look at the architecture of it. A proclaimed fast, which signals that some grave offence has polluted the community and must be found out. Naboth seated at the head, given the place of honour, so that the fall is public and total. 2 witnesses, because the law requires 2, and a capital charge cannot proceed on 1. A charge of blasphemy against God and against the king, which is a capital offence and which conveniently makes the condemned man's property forfeit. This is not a murder. This is a court. Every requirement of the law is met, and every one of them is used as a weapon. She does not break the legal system. She operates it. And the elders of Jezreel do exactly as they are told. Every one of them. Which is its own quiet indictment, and the text does not comment on it at all. Then the message comes back. Naboth is stoned, and he is dead. And Jezebel says to Ahab, Arise, take possession, for Naboth is not alive but dead. Elijah meets the king in the vineyard itself, and the oracle he delivers falls on the whole house, and it includes the line that hangs over the rest of this story. The dogs shall eat Jezebel by the rampart of Jezreel. Now, that is the story as chapter 21 tells it. But there is a second version of the same event buried a few chapters later, and it contains a detail that changes the crime. Part 8. The detail nobody mentions. 2 Kings 9. Jehu has just killed the king, and he tells his officer to throw the body onto the plot of ground that belonged to Naboth the Jezreelite, and then he explains why, and he quotes an oracle, and he says something that is not in chapter 21. Surely I have seen yesterday the blood of Naboth, and the blood of his sons. His sons. Go back to chapter 21 and look for them. They are not there. In the Vineyard chapter, Naboth dies alone. Only Naboth is accused. Only Naboth is stoned. Only Naboth is reported dead. But the recollection in 2 Kings takes it for granted that his children died with him. Historical critics have looked hard at this, and the most common conclusion is that we are looking at 2 versions of the same memory, preserved side by side, one of which retained the killing of the heirs, and one of which did not. And here is why it matters, and why it is not a trivia point. Remember the principle. Family land cannot be permanently alienated. It goes back to the lineage. It can be redeemed by a kinsman. If Naboth is executed and his sons are alive, then the vineyard does not become the king's in any lasting way. There are heirs. There is a claim. The whole scheme fails on the next generation. Kill the sons, and the lineage ends, and the land has nowhere to go back to. Which means the version in 2 Kings is describing a plan that actually works, and the version in 1 Kings is describing one that does not. I am not going to tell you which of those is the older memory, because scholars disagree and the evidence does not settle it, but the seam is real, and it is in your Bible, and almost nobody who tells this story mentions it. While we are being precise, let me point at something else, because it is one of the silences that later readers filled in with their own furniture. In this entire account, Jezebel never touches anyone, not once. She does not carry a weapon, she does not appear at the stoning, she does not stand over Naboth's body. Her instruments are letters, seals, witnesses, and officials. Everything she is accused of is done through the machinery of the state, at a distance, by men who obeyed. She is a bureaucrat of a killing. That is not exoneration. Signing the order is the crime. But it is worth noticing that the woman who became the byword for wild, sensual, uncontrolled female wickedness is, in the actual text, cold, procedural, and extremely competent. And that competence had built something, out on the ridge at Samaria and on the spur at Jezreel, that we can still walk through today, because in the last 100 years, people have dug both cities up. Part 9. The Ivory House. 1 Kings 22 verse 39 is one of those verses the eye slides over. The rest of the acts of Ahab and all that he did, and the ivory house which he built. The ivory house. It is mentioned once, without explanation, in the closing formula of his reign, in the tone of a clerk noting an item he does not intend to discuss. Between 1908 and 1935, in a series of excavations on the hill of Samaria, archaeologists recovered more than 12,000 pieces of carved ivory from the area of the royal palace. 12,000. Not 12,000 objects, 12,000 fragments, most of them small, because these were not statues, they were inlays. Thin carved plaques set into wooden furniture, into beds and thrones and chests and panelling, so that a room glowed pale when the lamps were lit. The wood is long gone. The ivory survived, because ivory does, and the style of them is unmistakable. Egyptianizing motifs filtered through Phoenician workshops, sphinxes with human faces, lotus and papyrus, palmettes, winged figures, the visual language of the Levantine coast, the exact craft tradition that Tyre and Sidon were famous for and exported across the whole Mediterranean. Among them is a motif we are going to come back to in a few minutes, and I want you to file it away. A woman's face, framed in a window, looking out. Now, I have to give you the caveats, because this is where a lot of retellings quietly cheat, and the caveats are more interesting than the cheat. The ivories were not found sealed in a burnt room with Ahab's name on the door. The Crowfoots, who published them in 1938, recovered most of the corpus from rubbish fills and later debris near the palace enclosure wall. Rubbish is good stratigraphy for some questions and terrible for others, and the question it is worst for is precisely the one we want to ask. And on stylistic grounds, most scholars today date the bulk of the collection to the 8th century, which is roughly 100 years after Ahab and Jezebel were dead. There is one anchor that pulls the other way, and it is a nice one. The Harvard expedition found, lying on the floor of the palace court alongside the largest ivory in the collection, a fragment of an alabaster jar incised with the name of the Egyptian pharaoh Osorkon II, who reigned in the early 9th century. Kathleen Kenyon, who did the hard stratigraphic work at Samaria, noted that this gave a valuable synchronism with the reign of Ahab. So where does that leave us? Honestly, here, the ivories prove beyond argument that the Israelite royal house at Samaria was steeped in Phoenician luxury craft. They make the biblical phrase ivory house look like an accurate description of something rather than a slur. They do not prove that any particular fragment sat in a room Jezebel walked through. Anyone who tells you they do is selling something. Then there is Jezreel. Between 1990 and 1996, David Osishkin and John Woodhead excavated the mound at Jezreel and found something nobody expected. A huge rectangular fortified enclosure laid out in a single deliberate act of royal construction, attributed to this dynasty. Roughly 11 acres, something in the order of 330 metres by 180, a casemate wall, towers at the corners, and, cut into bedrock on 3 sides where the natural slope did not protect it, a dry moat some 6 metres deep, with a rampart behind it. Cutting a moat that size out of solid rock is not a small undertaking. It is the kind of thing a state does when it has surplus labour, engineering capacity, and a reason. And the strangest thing about it is how briefly it was used. The pottery indicates a short occupation, essentially a single phase, built and then finished. Osishkin raised the possibility that it functioned as a royal and military base, perhaps connected with chariotry, which would sit rather neatly beside 2,000 chariots on an Assyrian monolith. Renewed work began at the site in 2012 under Norma Franklin and Jenny Eberling. Set that beside the story. A second royal centre out on the Jezreel Valley, purpose-built, heavily fortified, briefly occupied. A palace with a vineyard next to it, close enough that a king could look at it from his window and want it. A courtyard where a coup would end. There is a broader pattern here too. Scholars have identified a recognisable royal building signature across this dynasty's sites. An artificially levelled and filled elevated podium, a casemate wall, a rock-cut moat, sometimes a monumental gate. You find it at Samaria, at Jezreel, at Hazor, and Finkelstein and Lipschitz have argued you find it east of the Jordan in Moab as well, which would fit rather precisely with the Moabite stone's complaint about Israelite domination. This is the part of the story the 6 verses left out. The ground says these people built at a scale, and with a level of international taste, that the biblical account never allows itself to admire. Which brings us to a small grey stone that would connect all of it to one woman by name. If it is real. Part 10. The seal that might be hers. It is a scaraboid seal of grey opal, about 31 millimetres from top to bottom. That is a fraction over an inch, which does not sound like much until you handle ancient seals and discover that this is enormous. Most personal seals of the period are half that. It is elaborately carved, with a dense arrangement of Egyptianizing royal symbols. And across it, in Phoenician-style letters, the consonants that spell out a name. Yod, Zion, Beth, Lamed, Y, Z, B, L, Jezebel. You can see why this caught fire. There is one Jezebel in the historical record. One. The name is documented nowhere else in the ancient sources, and here it is, cut into a stone fit for a monarch. Now I promised you at the start that I would not launder anything, so here is the full picture, including the parts that hurt. The seal is unprovenanced. That is the single most damaging fact about it, and it cannot be fixed. It did not come out of a controlled excavation. It surfaced through a private collection and was donated to Israel's Department of Antiquities in the early 1960s. Nobody can tell you what layer it came from, what was next to it, or what part of the country it was found in. An unprovenanced object has been cut loose from everything that gives an object its meaning. It was published in 1964 by Nahman Avigad, one of the great epigraphers of the last century, and Avigad's own conclusion was cautious to the point of discouraging. He wrote that there was no basis for identifying the owner of the seal with this famous lady, while allowing that they may have been contemporaries, and that the seal seemed worthy of a queen. Fit for a queen, from roughly the right period, bearing a rare name known nowhere but the Bible, and we can never know for sure. That is a model of how to state a finding. It is also, notice, not a claim. Then in 2007 and 2008, Marjo Korpel of Utrecht revisited it and argued that it is Jezebel's. Her case rests on the top of the seal, which is broken away. She proposed that the missing portion carried 2 more letters, a lamed and an aleph, which would give the standard formula. Belonging to Jezebel, She pointed to the seal's exceptional size and to iconography she read as appropriate to a royal woman. And then the field pushed back, hard. Christopher Rolston, a specialist in Northwest Semitic paleography, argued that the letter forms cannot be securely dated to the 9th century, and that the identification is not tenable. He later moderated his phrasing somewhat, moving from a flat assertion that the script must be later to saying he was inclined to think so. And when a magazine asked Joseph Naver, the senior figure in Israeli paleography, to date the script from the surviving letters, his answer was that he could not tell. So the honest verdict, which is the only one worth having, is this. It is a magnificent object. It carries a name that is otherwise unknown outside scripture. It might belong to Queen Jezebel. It is also unprovenanced. Its date is contested by serious specialists, and the crucial letters that would make the case are on a piece that is missing. I could have told you that we have Jezebel's personal seal. It would have made a better thumbnail. It is not what the evidence supports, and I would rather you trusted the next thing I tell you, because the next thing is the scene everybody knows, and almost everybody has been reading it wrong. Part 11. The Paint and the Window. 2 Kings 9. Jehu, an army commander, has been anointed in secret by a servant of the prophet Elisha and told to destroy the house of Ahab. He drives to Jezreel. He kills the king of Israel in his chariot, and he kills the king of Judah, who happens to be visiting. And then he drives into the town, and Jezebel hears that Jehu has come to Jezreel. Read the next line carefully, because everything depends on it, and the way you have heard it read is almost certainly not the only way it can be read. And she painted her eyes with kohl, and adorned her head, and looked out of a window. For most of the last 2,000 years, that sentence has been read as seduction. The wicked queen puts on her makeup to try to bewitch the conqueror. That reading is everywhere. It is in the sermons and the paintings and the films, and it is the main reason the name became what it became. Now here is what I want you to notice. The text does not say why she did it. It gives you an action and no motive. Everything else, every word about seduction, every leer, has been supplied by readers. And a good many scholars, Janet Halgaines prominent among them, have argued that the plain reading points somewhere else entirely. Look at the situation. Jezebel is a queen mother, an office with real standing in that world, in a palace, in a town Jehu has just entered after murdering her son. She knows precisely what is coming. She has minutes. She does not run. She does not hide. She does not disguise herself. She does the one thing left to her, which is to decide how she will be seen. She puts on the paint and the ornaments of her rank, and she goes to the window, in the sight of the whole town, and she waits for the man who killed her child. Kohl, incidentally, was not a cosmetic in our sense. It was worn by men and women, it had practical uses in that sun, and it was the standard adornment of anyone of standing across Egypt and the Levant for millennia. Painting her eyes is not necessarily the act of a seductress. It is plausibly the act of a woman putting on her office. And then she opens her mouth, and this is the part that should settle it, because it is the last thing she ever says. Is it peace, Zimri, murderer of your master? That is not a proposition. That is a knife. Zimri was a chariot officer who, decades before, had assassinated his king, seized the throne, and lasted 7 days before he burned to death in his own palace. 7 days. Jezebel looks down at the man standing in her courtyard with her son's blood on his chariot wheels, and she calls him by the name of the shortest and most humiliating reign in the history of the kingdom. She is telling him he is already dead. She is telling him that men who take thrones this way do not keep them. Whatever else that woman was, she was not frightened, and she was not flirting. Jehu does not answer her. He looks up at the window, and he says, "Who is on my side? Who?" and 2 or 3 court officials look out. Eunuchs, the text says, which in that world means high household officers of the Queen's own establishment. Her staff, the men whose entire careers she had made. And he says, "Throw her down," and they throw her down. The text does not spare you any of it. Her blood spattered on the wall and on the horses, and he trampled her underfoot. Then Jehu goes inside and eats and drinks. Only afterwards does he say, "See now to this cursed woman, and bury her, for she is a king's daughter." That is a remarkable line, and it is easy to miss what it concedes. Even Jehu, standing in the wreckage, acknowledges her rank. She is a king's daughter. Bury her properly. But when they go out, there is nothing to bury. The dogs have been in the courtyard for the length of a meal, and the text gives you the inventory we began with. They found no more of her than the skull, and the feet, and the palms of her hands. There is a reason that catalogue is so specific, and it is not shock value. In the ancient Near East, the denial of burial was the ultimate curse. To lie unburied and be eaten by scavengers was a fate reserved in the curse formulas of treaties and inscriptions for the enemies of the gods. A body left on open ground was a body erased. The formula the text reaches for is a stock one in this history. The corpse becomes as dung upon the face of the field. It means no tomb, no name, no place to come back to. That is what is being said in that verse. Not simply that she died, that she was to be unmakeable, with no grave for anyone to visit. And there is one more layer here, and I want to give it to you with the caution it deserves, because it is one of those connections that is almost too good. Remember the motif I asked you to file away, from the ivories at Samaria, a woman's face framed in a window. That image is well known from Phoenician-style ivory carving of the 9th and 8th centuries, found at Samaria, at Nimrud in Assyria, at Arslan Tash in Syria. Who she is has never been settled. Some read her as a goddess, some as a sacred figure, some as something else entirely, and a major museum holding several of the plaques says frankly that there is no conclusive interpretation of whom they were meant to represent. A recent study by Henriette Berekema even argues the motif originated not on the Phoenician coast at all, but in the Egyptian delta. So did the narrator put Jezebel in that window deliberately, casting the Tyrian queen in the pose of a Phoenician ivory, the very luxury art her marriage brought into Israel, at the moment of her destruction? Some scholars think so. It is a stunning piece of literary craft if it is intentional. But we cannot demonstrate that it was intended, and I am not going to assert it. I will only tell you that the image existed, that it came from her world, and that the coincidence is remarkable. One last thing about this scene, and it is the most important correction in the whole video. Earlier in the chapter, when the king asks Jehu whether he comes in peace, Jehu answers with the accusation that has followed Jezebel ever since. What peace so long as the whoredoms of your mother Jezebel and her witchcrafts are so many? That is the source. That single sentence is the entire scriptural basis for 2,500 years of calling this woman a harlot. And look who is speaking. It is Jehu in the middle of a coup, moments before he kills the man he is speaking to, justifying the murder of a dynasty. That is not testimony. That is a man giving his reasons while he does it. And look at what the word is doing. In the prophetic vocabulary of the Hebrew Bible, whoredom is the standard conventional metaphor for worshipping other gods. It is used that way constantly. Of kings, of cities, of the whole nation, it is a covenant metaphor. Israel is the unfaithful spouse. That is what it means here, alongside witchcraft, which is a religious charge as well. Nowhere, in any passage, in any chapter, does the Bible accuse Jezebel of a single act of sexual misconduct. Not one. She is presented throughout as Ahab's wife, and, if anything, as a wife entirely devoted to her husband's interests. The harlot is not in the text. The harlot was added later, by us, over centuries. Hold on to that, because in a few minutes we are going to watch what got built on top of it. Part 12. The Blood of Jezreel. Jehu did not stop at the window. He wrote to the guardians of the royal princes in Samaria, and had 70 sons of the house of Ahab killed, and their heads sent to him in baskets, and piled in 2 heaps at the gate of Jezreel until morning. He killed the surviving relatives, the officials, the priests. He gathered the worshippers of Baal into their temple under the pretence of a great festival, and had them cut down inside it, and tore the building down, and made the site a latrine. The dynasty that had made Israel a regional power was erased in a matter of days. And the account in 2 Kings presents this as the fulfillment of prophecy. It is the payoff of the oracle in the Vineyard. The narrative machinery closes with a click. 2 things complicate that, and both of them are worth your attention. The first comes from outside the Bible. The Tel Dan inscription, that shattered Aramaic stela, appears to have Hazael of Damascus taking credit for killing the kings that 2 Kings attributes to Jehu. Scholars have argued about how to reconcile that ever since it was found, and the reconstructions vary. But at minimum it means there was a competing account in circulation, carved in stone by a neighbouring king, in which the events at Jezreel look rather different. 2 royal versions of the same bloodshed, each crediting a different man. And then there is what Jehu became. 12 years later he is on the Black Obelisk, on his face before Shalmaneser of Assyria, paying tribute. The man who purged the kingdom in the name of the God of Israel ended as a client of the empire, and the kingdom he had gutted spent the next century weakening under Aramean and then Assyrian pressure. Whatever the coup accomplished, it did not make Israel stronger. But the second complication is the one I find genuinely extraordinary, and it comes from inside the Bible itself. Roughly a century later, a prophet named Hosea is called to speak in the northern kingdom, and in the very first chapter, God tells him to name his firstborn son Jezreel, and then explains why. For yet a little while, and I will avenge the blood of Jezreel upon the house of Jehu, and will cause the kingdom of the house of Israel to cease. Read that again, slowly. The blood of Jezreel. The purge, the heads in the baskets, the woman under the horses, and the God of Israel, speaking through a prophet, says that he will avenge it. On Jehu's house. This is not an outside critic. This is not a revisionist scholar. This is a canonical prophetic book condemning, in the strongest possible terms, the massacre that 2 Kings frames as divine justice. The Bible is arguing with itself, in public, about whether Jehu was righteous. I cannot overstate how much this matters for how we read the whole story. The scripture that gives us the case against Jezebel also gives us a verdict against the man who executed her, and a judgment on the blood spilled at Jezreel. It contains its own dissent. And that should make us slower, not faster, to be certain about any of it. If the tradition itself could not agree about the meaning of what happened in that courtyard, then the confident, tidy version we inherited, the one where a wicked foreign woman gets exactly what she deserves and everybody goes home satisfied, is not the Bible's version. It is a later simplification of the Bible. The tradition, though, is not what killed her reputation. Something else did, and it happened long after the last stone of Jezreel had fallen. Part 13. The Name That Would Not Die. Turn to the book of Revelation, chapter 2. The risen Christ is dictating letters to 7 churches in Asia Minor, and to the church at Thyatira he says this: I have this against you, that you tolerate that woman Jezebel, who calls herself a prophetess, and is teaching and seducing my servants. There was a woman at Thyatira. She was a real person, in a real congregation in the late 1st century, with a real name, and it was almost certainly not Jezebel. It is very hard to imagine anyone in that period naming a daughter Jezebel, any more than anybody today names a son Judas. What we are watching in that verse is the moment the name stops being a person and becomes a label. It has been detached from the queen and turned into an accusation you can pin on somebody else. Jezebel becomes a type, a category of woman, and once a name becomes a category, it can be applied to anyone, forever, by anyone who wants to. Everything that follows. Through the patristic period and the Middle Ages and into the Reformation, Jezebel is the standard byword for the idolatrous woman, the foreign influence at court, the wife who governs through her husband. In the political and religious fights of early modern England, the accusations flew in every direction, and that final taunt of hers, "Is it peace?" Zimri turns up hurled at kings and rebels alike by people who knew exactly what they were quoting. And then the name crossed the Atlantic, and something worse happened to it. In American history, Jezebel became one of the controlling stereotypes projected onto black women. Alongside the figures scholars call Mammy and Sapphire, the Jezebel image cast black women as inherently and aggressively sexual, and that image did specific work. It was used to rationalize and excuse sexual violence under slavery, and it long outlasted slavery in advertising, in entertainment, in courtrooms, and in the assumptions of people who had never heard of the Queen of Israel. Historians and scholars of the period, including the work collected by the Jim Crow Museum at Ferris State University and the research of Carolyn West on controlling images, have documented that career in detail. I raise it for one reason. Everything in that stereotype is built on the sexual charge. And we have just seen, in the text itself, that the sexual charge is not there. It was manufactured out of a metaphor about worship, spoken by a usurper mid-coup, and then hardened over centuries into a slur that was eventually used to justify the abuse of women who had nothing to do with any of it. That is a reception history. It is not scripture, and I want that line to be very bright. But it is what the word did after it left the text, and I do not think you can honestly tell this story and leave it out. There is a modern chapter too. In some charismatic and Pentecostal teaching of the 20th century, you will encounter the phrase the Jezebel spirit, used to describe an alleged demonic influence characterized by manipulation, control, and seduction. In practice, the label has tended to land on women, and disproportionately on women in positions of leadership. I want to describe that neutrally, because people I respect hold it sincerely. But I have to be accurate about one thing. The phrase is not in the Bible. There is no Jezebel spirit anywhere in Scripture. It is a modern construct, assembled long afterwards out of the Revelation label and centuries of accumulated association, and Christian writers across a wide theological range, from Russell Moore in Christianity Today to organizations working on the interpretation of these texts, have said as much. Which means that the woman with which we started, the daughter of Ethbaal, the girl sent south in a treaty, has been made to carry an extraordinary amount of freight. Almost none of it was in the file her enemies compiled, and her enemy's file was damning enough on its own. So, what is left when you have taken all of it apart? Something is left. That is the thing I want to say clearly before we finish, because the honest position is not that she was innocent. A woman ordered the judicial murder of a man for a piece of ground, using a forged document, a rigged court, 2 paid liars, and a religious charge. The text says she did that. There is no reconstruction of 9th century politics that makes it acceptable, and the prophetic tradition that condemned it was right to condemn it. Whatever else this video has argued, it has not argued that away, and a woman is said to have hunted down and killed prophets, and men hid in caves and lived on smuggled bread because of her. If that is history, and it may well be, it is a real crime with real names underneath it that we will never know. The case against Jezebel does not collapse. What collapses is the caricature that was built on top of it. Here is what she actually was, as best as the text and the ground together allow us to say it. A princess of the greatest trading city on the Mediterranean coast, sent to a foreign court as the seal on a treaty her family made. The queen of a kingdom that was richer, stronger, and more internationally connected than the Bible ever admits. A kingdom whose name in the Assyrian archives was her husband's family name for 100 years. A woman who kept her own gods in a world where almost nobody expected her not to. Who wielded royal power with a cold competence that frightened the men who wrote about her. Who committed at least one act of state murder that the tradition never forgave, and who, when the soldiers finally came, put on the ornaments of her rank, went to the window in front of the whole town, and told the man who had murdered her son that he would not last the year. And who was then written up, generations later, in a rival capital, by men with a theological argument to win, and handed down to us as a word. We do not have her voice. She speaks only a handful of times in the whole Bible, and almost every one of them is an order or a threat. There is not a single line anywhere in which she explains herself. We do not have her seal, whatever the auction catalogues would like to say. We do not have her tomb, because they made sure there would never be one. We do not even know for certain whether the only woman who ever ruled Judah, Athaliah, was her daughter, because the text contradicts itself about that. All we have is the file her enemies kept, and the strange, stubborn fact that even a hostile file, read carefully, will not say what everybody says it says. That is the thing I would leave you with. Not that the Bible is unreliable. The opposite. Read closely. The text is far more careful, far more restrained, and far more honest about its own gaps than the tradition that grew up around it. Every one of the corrections in this video came from Scripture itself, sitting there in plain sight, waiting for somebody to read the verse instead of the reputation. The people who did the damage were not the writers. They were the retellers. And there is one more thread to pull, because the story does not end in that courtyard. Somewhere south of Jezreel, in Jerusalem, on the same day that Jehu was killing everything with Omride blood in it, a woman of that same royal house was sitting on a throne of her own. When the news reached her that her son was dead, she did something that no other woman in the entire history of Israel or Judah ever did. She took the crown herself, and she held it for 6 years, and to make certain no one could take it from her, she gave an order about the royal children that is one of the darkest sentences in the Hebrew Bible. Her name was Athaliah, and the story of what she did, and of the one child who survived it, hidden in the temple for 6 years by his aunt, is where this one truly ends. I will see you there.